Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
I am now going to deliberately free up some phone lines for you to put questions to Ian Wright, because I know, like me, you'll have watched that with a growing sense of wonder, actually, and whatever it is you were wondering about, you can now get an answer to on the usual number 03456060973. Ian, I'll start the questioning, if I may. Which is usually the other way around for you, as we saw so effectively on the telly last week. What is the point of a select committee hearing like the one we saw last week involving Mike Ashley?
It's to get to the truth, and it's to really try to improve matters. I think we've got a really important select committee looking at business, innovation and skills. We're looking at how do we make our country more productive, how do we make our businesses more profitable and more competitive, how do we raise the skills levels, and linked in with that is what are the employment practices in some of our companies. Does the legislation need to change? Does it need to be enforced in a much more effective fashion? And Sports Direct had a lot of coverage about, exploitation of workers, not being paid the minimum wage, the general working practices, the 6 strikes and you're out. And so, that's why we asked Mr. Ashley to come before us and talk to us about, what was going on in his company.
Could he have refused?
He did refuse.
Of course.
So we spent a good 3 or 4 months trying to persuade him to come. And I thought this was a point of principle. I was pushing this.
But legally, could he have continued to refuse?
We would have. The next step would have been for me to write to the Speaker. So he was coming, Tuesday, 7th of June.
Sure.
What I was going to do on the afternoon is write to the Speaker saying, can I have an urgent debate about this, because somebody's refused to come to a select committee.
So you would be sitting there on Tuesday waiting to see if he turned up, effectively?
Essentially, although, we did find out within
relatively
I
appreciate
notice.
That, but it's still fascinating.
Yeah. But we'd had the other sessions lined up. We had the trade unions, we had the agency companies, and the third session was always going to be Mike Ashley. And we wanted to get his side of the story. That was one of the things I put to him. We're going to hear from people. We had a private session with people who work for Sports Direct before the public session, so we got a good sense of what was going on.
And who's communicating with who, Ian? Because your people and his people.
Essentially, yeah. So what? We've got clerks, essentially the civil service of the select committee, who are dealing with his people, yeah.
I see. The question next week will become even more pertinent with regard to Philip Green, won't it, on whether or not people have to turn up, but that's not your committee, of course.
But it is, because we have that joint committee. One of the things that I wanted to do when I became chair of the select committee, I was a minister in the Labour government, and I was always conscious that Whitehall is very silo-driven. Often departments don't talk to one another, and I didn't want the select committees to do that. So I'm encouraging as much as possible joint working. So it's a joint committee between ourselves on BIS and Frank Fields at Work and Pensions.
And that's going to be fireworks as well. It's a remarkable fortnight for select committees, both of which, of course, both issues you're heavily involved with. Is that just coincidence? Is it just the fact that these two deals, the Sports Direct investigation and the British Home Stores collapse, have happened on the same bit of the calendar?
It is coincidence. It's interesting how they've all sort of meshed together. So there's talk that Mike Ashley wanted to buy BHS, and he admitted that last week at the select committee. I think there's a wider point about what sort of capitalism, what sort of system do we have? Does capitalism have any sort of moral agenda? I was on LBC last night talking about that.
Yes, I know.
So it's a case of, can you have morality in capitalism, or is it just going to be fierce in tooth and claw, and people will just try and do whatever it takes to make a quick, fast buck?
Or laws. So, it's the tension between people acting within the law but somehow without a moral guidance, or people use the phrase moral compass, or you can force them to act in a, quotes, morally fashion by introducing legislation.
A number of things there. I think, in terms of, is the legal framework the right balance?
Yeah.
So you want people to make money, you want profit, you want creation of wealth, but not at the expense of exploitation of workers. You've got to pay them what is legally responsible for. But also, it's the enforcement of those laws as well. You can have the best legal system in the world, but if it's not enforced, it doesn't mean anything, does it? So making sure that actually we have an enforcement system that backs it up with teeth as well.
So, in terms of power, you can compel people to appear ultimately, but you can't punish them in any way?
It's untested in modern times. My understanding.
What does that mean?
So the last person who was called to the bar of the House was the editor of the Sunday Express, I think,
okay,
who badmouthed MPs, and he was called to get a ticking off by the Speaker in about 1955.
Wow.
The last person who was fined for not turning up to it wouldn't be a select committee then, but some sort of parliamentary inquiry, was 1666. So we were looking at old precedents.
Fire of London, practically, isn't it?
Yeah, that was the same year. I mean, and then there's a question, a wider point, when all the stuff about Sports Direct and BHS, when we've carried out our inquiries, there's a wider point about what do we do to make sure that in the event of somebody refusing to come to a select committee, how do we have that modern framework to almost compel them?
So you extracted from Mike Ashley effectively a confession that he hadn't been paying his staff the minimum wage, which is not legally actionable because you're covered by parliamentary privilege in a select committee.
But we also got out of him that HMRC, who are responsible for the enforcement of the minimum wage, are investigating what he's doing. When we produce our report, I think we got a number of concessions out of Mike Ashley in terms of minimum wage, in terms of working practices. That's 6 strikes and you're out. The allegations of sexual harassment amongst female members of staff, and then that wider corporate governance point. He said he would welcome an independent and impartial review of corporate governance in terms of how his company is run.
Did you believe him? Did you believe him?
Yeah, I did.
He came across as credible to you.
I think he spoke. I think he spoke the truth. I think he often, he talks. He didn't try and sort of balance out what he was saying. He spoke as he found. And I think, he was telling us things in terms of his company. They can't have been palatable for him, but were important. We got concessions out of him. He said that he'd have a look, and we'll keep him to that.
Right, I've freed up a couple of phone lines now, so if you want to put something to Ian yourself, having watched that remarkable exchange, that remarkable committee hearing, you can do. The number you need is 0345 6060 Ian's staying with us until 11 o'clock. I've got plenty more I want to ask him, so don't feel obliged to get involved. But if there's an angle that we're missing, or if there's something that occurred to you last week that you're keen to get a sort of expert informed answer to, then that number is 0345 6060 The broader question is your committee's brief, this. The exploitation of workers. Are we moving backwards in this country at the moment?
That's the fear.
What's your view?
I don't want to live in a country where the economic model is let's just try and pay people as low as possible. And actually disregard things like health and safety. Actually, we're not going to thrive like that. We'll never be able to compete with the low-wage economies, and I don't think we should try to. I think we've got to try and, really add value, have high skills, be able to, price our products and services a bit more because of that. That needs a good education system to do that. I worry that retailers, particular sector, that can have exploitation of workers. And
more the supply of goods to sell than the actual people on the shop floor.
But also there could be an element of, what's happening on the shop floor as well. But warehouses are an obvious place
and they're
where...
hidden away, aren't they? That's the point.
But the other thing that I would mention is the care sector. I had 2 constituents come to see me at my constituency surgery in Hartlepool on Friday. Caring for vulnerable people, having to do sleepovers to do it, but not being paid the minimum wage to do that. So again, that's often hidden. Care sector is something that we'd really be keen to look at as well. In that wider point about what does the future world of work look like?
Where are the trade unions in all of this?
The trade unions were fantastic. I don't know if you saw the select committee in
I did, but they're fantastic in reaction to the stories that have emerged. They should really have been in before the stories. That's what unions historically are charged with.
No,
isn't it?
to be fair, I mean, there are a number of things there I'd mention. To be fair, they broke this Sports Direct story. They were pushing this
with the Guardian
and the BBC,
yes.
And the evidence that they provided was high quality stuff. In terms of the care sector, there will be some degree of unionisation, but the nature of the new companies that dominate the care sector, they're often not unionised. Now, I think that's a problem. I think to have a good, modern, innovative economy, you need trade unions to play a massive role. I'm a trade unionist myself. I'm a big fan of trade unions. I think they play a vital role.
And yet they probably enjoy less public support today from without the membership than at any point since their formation. The demonisation of the trade unions is endemic, isn't it?
Demonisation, I think that's a negative thing. That I think, and it produces a snowball effect. So people think, oh, trade unions.
They end up hating the organisation that could actually protect them from an exploitative employment.
And you see in the media all the time about these, ridiculous trade union demands. But I have to cite something that happened about 4 or 5 years ago. General Motors was doing a review of Europe. They were going to close car factories because there was overcapacity. Thanks to the work of Unite, working together with management, and to be fair, the coalition government, they pulled together and saved Ellesmere Port. The new Astra is being built in Britain because of the direct positive involvement of trade unions. Trade unions are a massive part of a modern positive economy.
We'll go to Paul in Enfield first after the travel news. After Paul, it could be you. Joined by Ian Wright, Chair of the Select Committee, currently looking at, as you've heard, the situation in that Sports Direct warehouse, but the broader issues as well thrown up by British Home Stores collapse and wider issues of exploitation. It should be, and I've told you this a billion times. I'm talking to the listener now, Ian, not to you. I've told you this a billion times. There's stories that I think should be at the top of the news agenda and aren't. Not on a day like today, as we absorb the tragedy in Florida, but the idea of ordinary working people now enjoying arguably less rights in the workplace, fewer rights in the workplace than their parents did. That's really what populist red top newspapers should be getting cross about. But they're not. It's 10:46. Ian Wright is with me, the chair of the Business Innovation and Skills Select Committee, where the Sports Direct founder and boss, Mike Ashley, had such an interesting encounter last week. Still plenty to get through, but I'll just squeeze in a quick question from Paul, who's in Enfield. Paul, what would you like to ask Ian? Do you want to pop those headphones on in?
Yes, I welcome what the Select Committee has done towards Mike Ashley, but I just wonder, is it really a qualified success? Particularly Mike Ashley is a very well-known figure because of Association Newcastle Football Club, so he may be morally pressured for other reasons to attend. But my concern, and I do support capitalism, but the unacceptable side, like Sir Philip Green able to take huge, almost £1 billion out of BHS and then be sold for £1. And there are many instances like this. The moral issue, isn't it time that this moral issue needs to be redefined and perhaps put into statute books so people can't take money out, at the expense of it. At the BHS store, it's probably far worse in Sports Direct because they're going to lose their jobs. At least people in Sports Direct, although for not very bad practices, they're still going to keep their jobs.
No, oddly, there may be a crossover with Mike Ashley saying over the weekend that he was still interested perhaps in purchasing some of the sites of British Home Stores, although the staff there would probably be chilled by the prospect of what might happen to them if the evidence you throw up at your Select Committee is more widespread. What do you think? You touched on this earlier, Ian, this broader question of where legislation and morality kind of almost conflict with each other.
And Paul makes a really important point. He talks about Philip Green taking money out of the business. This is not about wealth creation. It's about wealth extraction. He hasn't invested in BHS and making sure that it's more competitive. And that's a wider point about the larger Arcadia Group. The largest dividend in British corporate history, £1.3 billion. How can that help produce investment and innovation when it's being channeled through a tax haven in Monaco? We have to look at this closely in terms of, I'm all for making sure that we encourage entrepreneurialism, we encourage innovation, and we create wealth. But this is not creating wealth, certainly not spreading prosperity. This is actually making sure that one person or a family get very rich at the expense of others. That can't be right.
There is a sense abroad. I mean, one sees messages and responses like, well, look, listen to that bloke, he's never run a business. They might be talking about you. Listen, he's never, or me, or anybody who says, maybe some of these billionaires do occasionally do things that aren't very good for the whole country, and then you say, well, you've never run a business, you don't know what it's like, and that's got some legs, that argument. I mean, it might not make a lot of sense, but a lot of people like it.
I used to work in business. I'm an accountant by training, or maybe you shouldn't admit that. But
it's better than a politician.
So it's not as if I'm not one of these, did politics at university, became a researcher, then became an MP. It wasn't that. I had what's known as a proper job. So, I was an accountant, I worked in the private sector, I know how business can operate, and that's one of the reasons I wanted to do this job, because I knew that perspective and experience would come in handy. But I do think it's important. As I said, I want to encourage people who innovate. I want to encourage people who want to create successful businesses, employ people, but at the expense of, in the terms of BHS, losing 11,000 jobs on the high street. Is that what we want?
And public money will have to be found to prop up the pension gap as well. Is that right?
Ultimately, we all pay because
Yeah.
the Pension Protection Fund is funded by a levy that all companies pay into. You know, if there's a black hole in the PPF, prices might have to go up in order to compensate for the levy. So we all pay ultimately. And actually, if those 11,000 people can't find other jobs, the redundancy payments, the
Of course, yes.
employment, unemployment costs, we all pay for that through our taxes too.
What would you like to see, Paul? What would look like progress for you?
Well, just add on to that, also, Manchester United Football Club, an American owner, bought it on the same almost some principles, you know, borrowing huge amounts of money to finance that purchase. That's another aspect of it. I like to see, you know, I think your guest is Mr. Wright. He made an excellent point. Wealth extractions as opposed to wealth creation. I think that to me was well defined. Put that in the statute books. Take money out for wealth creation, but not extract, not for personal means.
How are you going to do that? That's like outlawing payments.
Well, this is a limited company. It's a separate legal entity. The
Yes.
director shouldn't be able to do anything except help the company to create jobs, create wealth, rather than use it for personal reasons. I think this...
Well, I go to work for personal reasons, Paul. You go to work for personal reasons. Even Ian goes to work for personal reasons.
I think there are big differences between us as individuals and these people who own huge companies whose thousands of jobs that depend on it. Look, I think in majority huge multinationals or small or business do operate in a kind of a civil way, but I think we need to legislate for these oddballs who really take advantage of certain legal stipulations that allow them to create their own wealth at the expense of others, clearly defining at the expense of others.
That's a crucial distinction, and that's the challenge of our time, really.
James, I have to say, I think Paul knows his stuff.
He does.
And the example of Manchester United...
All my callers do, Ian.
Manchester United is a really good case in point in terms of, you know, it was a debt-free club. It was one of the biggest brands in world football. It was new owners bought it through debt, pushed that debt through the company, and the interest payments arguably saddled it with a point where it couldn't compete in the Premier League. You know, it's very striking that the performance on the pitch has suffered as a result. You know, I know they've won the FA Cup and all of that, but actually, you know, is it right that these owners, you know, saddle these great companies with debt, extract huge bonuses for themselves, and are not investing in the companies and in the staff?
What happens next then, with regard to the two cases that you're looking at the moment? Where are we?
We're coming to the end of looking at BHS. We're pulling together a report on Sports Direct. Ultimately, our job is clear. We need to add value. We need to say, what is it that we need to improve in British corporate life to minimise this? I think this is probably at the extreme exact ends.
Sure.
This is not happening every single day in every single business. But there is that culture that Paul mentioned. You know, how do we ensure that, you know, these often greedy people are going to take out huge loans, going to borrow, stack companies with debt, and pay themselves massive dividends? That's not in the interests of British corporate life. So what do we need to do to change it in order to make sure that this sort of thing is regulated out of existence?
Do other countries have legislation in place that we could learn from?
Some of the Scandinavian countries, Sweden's very good in terms of making sure that it's not just about the shareholder. There's a sense that businesses are part of society, and so it's all stakeholders. It's the staff, it's customers. You know, a good example to use, and you know, one of the things that the trade unions think is, why don't we have workers on boards? So in terms of setting the strategic direction, in terms of thinking about takeovers, that's a good example. Should we be having workers on boards in order to make sure that on the shop floor there's an actual voice in the boardroom as well?
Which we had in the past in this country as well. Do you think Philip Green will turn up next week?
Yeah, I do. I can't
Call for Frank Field's resignation this week.
Yeah, but I can't believe... If he doesn't turn up, I think that sends out such a bad message that it looks like he's got something to hide, that he's running scared. I can't believe that he won't turn up on Wednesday.
And if he doesn't, then you go to see, or Frank goes to see the Speaker, and we put in place that chain of events you described earlier. And we've gone down that
path with Mike Ashley. You know, we'd be doing the same thing with Philip Green, yeah.
A few of my regular listeners are asking whether or not you could summon TfL and Uber. Uber have appeared in front of a committee, haven't they?
Impede in front of us.
Yes.
We've been doing an inquiry into the digital economy, and we had London cabbies, and we had Uber in terms of, you know, disruption is good in a modern economy, James, but is that at the expense of people who are providing a decent service, who are getting a living. You know, how do we encourage disruption whilst at the same time not exploitation?
We're going to run out of time, but yeah, because do you know the word we use often on this programme is dignity. A lot of these employment practices seem to be depriving people of dignity that we once took for granted.
I think that came out loud and clear in the Sports Direct evidence. Stopping pregnant women from going to the toilet or getting a drink. You know, we're in Britain in 2016. For goodness sake, I thought these wars were won a long time ago.
Ian Wright, thank you very much indeed. It's been a real pleasure having you here, and we'll do it again, I think, if with your permission, of course. It's coming up to 11 o'clock. Ian Wright, the chair of the Business Select Committee there, just providing a little bit more light into the corners of the Constitution, in fact, or at least constitutional matters that we had a glimpse of last week, and more to come, of course, later this week.